Thank you so much, David, and to all of you for being here today. It has really been an honor and a privilege to be amidst you, and I'm really inspired and struck by your level of engagement. And my discussion comments today will intersect a lot with a number of my wonderful colleagues who've gone before me, but I promise to take you right to the beginning at the end of it. And so many things have changed in India. One of the things that has not changed so much is that India has always been a highly diverse place. And when we talk about India's ethnic diversity, it is also that it's diverse along a range of different types of diversity. And so I'll take you through some of India's diversity, especially around religion, indigeneity, caste, and language. And actually, we missed a few slides at the beginning, but we'll begin here. And this kind of diversity, this idea that there is a place in the world that is as diverse as India is usually in the political economy of development seen as a curse. And so it's called the so-called curse of diversity. And the general idea here is that ethnic diversity is both bad for development, for human development, as well as bad for ethnic conflict. So the general idea being that the more people you have from different ethnic groups, the more likely you are to see ethnic conflict, including potentially civil war. And so strong has been this empirical association that Abhijit Banerjee, who is from India, works in India, and won the Nobel Prize in Economics along with Esther Duflo a few years ago, has called this relationship, the so-called curse of diversity, as one of the most powerful hypotheses in political economy. And through my talk today, I want to push against this received wisdom, this conventional understanding of the way in which diversity is supposed to influence democracy, development, and competition. I want to do it because, of course, it's deeply normatively troubling because, as we know, ethnic diversities, populations are hard to change. So in some ways, is demography destiny? And if you happen to have a diverse population, does that condemn you to low levels of development and to democracy and to conflict? And of course, the fact that some of the most diverse places in the world tend to be places in the global south. So what are the implications of this so-called curse of diversity for countries like India in the global south? And this is just an example of an article that kickstarts this industry of predicting this curse of development by two economists. And you can see from the title the kind of scholarship that it has generated. This growth tragedy. So this idea that diversity is deterministically going to lead to a growth tragedy. And I want to push against this by really bringing in the role of politics and to say that whether or not, and therefore I put again here the curse of diversity, but with a question mark at the end of it, which is whether or not diversity is a curse for development depends critically on the politics of it and on the way in which it is politically constructed and understood. And so I'm going to take you through, as I said, these four types of diversity, but I'm going to thread it through gender. And so I'll begin by religion, which in many ways you've already heard a lot about. India is a majority Hindu, but a highly diverse country, has always been. And in many ways, religion is India's founding trauma. The partition of the subcontinent along religious lines, which Professor Mehta has already alluded to, is a key defining moment in modern South Asian history, and it happens on the basis of the two-nation theory, by which South Asia's Muslims are supposed to have their own homeland and Hindus their other. And this is a population map from 1909, but it really maps very closely onto the partition that occurs. And the parts in green, the Muslim majority areas, become West and East Pakistan, and of course, then finally in the 1970s, the country of Bangladesh. The partition of India sees, again, you've heard this already, is a horrific event. About 15 million displaced. Again, there's a lot of controversy about figures, but about 2 million dead, and trains with corpses coming across the border. There's a really moving, powerful literature and movies around the partition of India, if you're interested. And again, just to mention that a lot of this violence plays out, as it does in civil wars and conflicts around the world, on the bodies of women. And we don't have exact counts, but the number of of rapes, of gang rapes, of abductions, and of the violence of partition as played out on the bodies of women, we are only beginning really to come to terms with the extent of it. And I was really struck this morning by Professor Mehta's very evocative idea of the distinction between history and memory. And I think it's really important to think, what do we choose to remember about our pasts? But also equally important to ask, what do we choose to forget? What do we choose deliberately not to remember? And to me, it really is indicative of the deep, continued trauma of the partition of India, that growing up, it was something that was spoken of in my family, which is very much a partition family. My mother's side of the family came from Lahore and Amritsar, twin cities that were divided across the border. It was not something that was spoken about. My grandmother and her sisters were both in their late teens when India was partitioned, and yet this was not something that they ever spoke about. When we would talk about it, learn about it in history books, or see it, or have it referenced in some way, they would talk to each other in Punjabi and be like, leave it, why talk about such things? And in India's public memory, there was no monument, hardly any songs, no memorialization to this traumatic event that had occurred until just a few years ago. And this is the Partition Museum in the city of Amritsar, which is in Punjab, which was divided. There's also now a branch in Delhi, which I highly recommend that all of you visit. It is a really important memorialization and a kind of rewriting of memory, if not so much of history. So these are India and Pakistan's founding fathers, Jinnah and Nehru, and they sandwich Mountbatten, who looks quite hot and stuffy, as you can see in his suit. It's August 1947, a monsoon in India. And the critical thing to remember is Jinnah is usually attributed as the kind of initial proponent of the two-nation theory for the state of Pakistan. But it's really important to remember that Nehru and India's founding fathers reject this. And instead, India puts in place a constitution, which again Professor Mehta referred to this morning. This is the preamble to the Constitution of India that he referred to. And the critical word that I want to draw your attention to is secular. India is and was founded explicitly in rejection of the two-nation theory, not as a country for Hindus, but as a country in which all religious minorities had equal rights. It was a secular democratic republic. And the presence of course, Sikh, Jain, Christian, but critically Muslim minorities have been highly generative for India: art, cuisine, culture, music. There is no way to separate India's Islamic past from its present. And also to keep in mind that the Hindu-Muslim conflict, the cleavage, has competitive as it has been, has seen more peace than conflict. My colleague at the Watson Institute, whom you heard from earlier today at Brown, Professor Varshni, along with Professor Wilkinson, put together a data set in which they used newspapers to put together essentially estimates of Hindu-Muslim violence in India. And the two facts that come out from that very important data set is, one, there's hardly ever any Hindu-Muslim violence in India's countryside. It is an almost entirely urban phenomenon, and that too is confined only to certain cities at certain points in time. And so to again push against this idea that demography is destiny, and to say that when Hindus and Muslims have fought until recently, which you've heard is a different landscape now, it has been at certain points in time and only in certain places. Hindu-Muslim harmony, or at least peace, has very much been the norm. Of course, I say here hate is a political project. Ambassador Rao was actually telling me about a song, I think from the American South, in which she said, you have to be taught to hate, you have to be 7 or 8. And hate is very much a political project, and the rise of Hindutva in many ways epitomizes that. And in particular, it marks a move away from constitutionally enshrined principles, in particular, the enshrinement of secularism. You've heard already, Ms. Schmoll mentioned it, she's written very powerfully about it, the Citizenship Amendment Act, the National Registry of Citizens, 2 laws that introduced a religious distinction, a discrimination into India's secular constitution. They haven't been fully passed, but they're very much been tabled. But what I want to draw your attention to is also the tradition and continued thriving of resistance, in particular peaceful civil disobedience to such acts. And so I'll show you some images only because they're so powerful and sometimes easily forgotten because these are just the months before COVID-19. And so this is Delhi for you. Hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Delhi coming out to protest the Citizenship Amendment Act. This is from a book called Har Sham Shaheen Bagh, which memorializes the women of this one neighborhood, which happens to be very close to where My family lives in Delhi, and these are intergenerational Muslim women. This is actually a book that my sister made under very difficult circumstances. She went to RISD, like David's daughter, son, like David's son. I discovered another great educational institution in the state of Rhode Island, the Rhode Island School of Design. And she made this book, which had a very hard time getting out in India, but has done quite well internationally. The FT had a kind of huge spread on it. But she lived with these women who were on the highway, blocking a highway, saying, we are the keepers of India's constitution. They were holding up symbols of India's founding fathers, of the constitution, to protest and to let you know that these political projects are also projects that are being actively contested, very interestingly, by women. And I want to mention this is the same metro station near Shaheen Bagh. That is it on the eve of the pandemic. And of course, COVID-19 provides a justification, a reason for the regime to come down and clear what was one of India's very important and underemphasized moments of civil disobedience against the politics of Hindutva. So in many ways, talking about the role of women, India is, by many accounts, it's called, quote, one of the worst places in the world to be a woman. And the reason that they say this is, of course, because of the high rates of missing women. Amartya Sen, again, another Nobel laureate in economics from India, has talked about how women go missing at each stage of their their life. Before they're born, high rates of female feticide, high rates of female infanticide, high rates of female malnutrition, much lower access to education, difference between male and female literacy rates, infant mortality, all indicators in India are very high across gender lines. And of course, you have crimes against women on an everyday basis, including very high rates of intimate partner violence. There is a low rate of domestic labor force participation, and in this gender gap report in 2023, India actually ranked 127 out of 146, so very much at the bottom. And so you have this paradox. I mean, you've already heard these descriptions of India as complex, contradictory, so I'm going to bring paradoxical into your lexicon. And so on the one hand, you have women leaders in India. You have prime ministers of Bangladesh, of Pakistan, of India, who are women. And on the other hand, you do have what I described to you in terms of a deeply patriarchal society. Within this patriarchy, women have been at the vanguard of protests. So I spoke to you about the women of Shaheen Bagh, that was most recently in 2019, protesting the Citizenship Amendment Act. But I want to draw your attention to the role of women in India's peaceful civil disobedience movement against British rule, against the British Raj, which you've heard about, and also really importantly, early environmental movements. So these are women from some of the poorest places in India, and you can see what a beautiful large tree that is, that they're coming together to embrace. It was a movement called the Chipko movement. Chipko means to stick. And they stood and had this civil disobedient, very successful protest against the felling of these trees back in the 70s. And this continues. This is Arundhati Roy, the novelist you've already heard referred to, with Medha Patekar protesting the Sardar Sarovar Dam, which is a dam on the river of Narmada. So it's not just women. These women have come disproportionately sometimes from the most marginalized communities, the women of Shaheen Bagh, women from indigenous communities, and Dalits. So Emily Schmoll told you a lot about how, despite the persecution, fierce, ferocious, fearless media journalists in India are continuing to do their job under the most unrelenting and dangerous of circumstances. And in this, Khabar Lahariya, which is a feminist, Dalit-led collective that is now in its 20th year, has been publishing a newspaper. Now it's gone digital only. This is the Academy Award-nominated short film about Khabar Lahariya called Writing with Fire. It didn't win the Oscar, but it's a beautiful movie, and I again recommend it if you're interested in learning more. But this rural feminist Dalit-led media collective has regularly 15 million views online on YouTube. And I put it up here to give you an instance and to bring alive again what Emily Schmoll has already mentioned, which is the resistance lies among the most vulnerable, the most marginalized of India's population. So I'll talk very briefly about indigeneity, just to say that in India they're called scheduled tribes in the constitution. There's a complicated understanding of indigeneity, which I won't get into, but these are some of the poorest people you will find in India. And I just want you to notice this map, which is of their geographic spread. In total, they're just under 10% of India's population. And to map this onto this, which is a map of India's Maoist insurgency, which in the early 2000s was described by the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh as India's most prominent security threat. And so a lot of these indigenous communities have been campaigning for the protection of their lands from mining. As I said, I won't get too much into it. I'm happy to get into it more into Q&A. But you can see how the proportion of indigenous population, especially in what is called the Red Corridor, maps onto this incidence of actual Maoist insurgency that has been reducing in recent years. So caste, in many ways, is the elephant in the room every time we talk about India, and it has already been brought up today. The word Dalit, I put it on that slide previously, is a word that means the broken people. And it is a word that was used by Baba Saheb Ambedkar. Again, you've heard Baba Saheb referred to earlier today, a Dalit icon, a leading figure in India's independence movement who drafted the Indian Constitution. And he said, you know, we don't want to be called the children of God, which was Gandhi's term for them. Scheduled castes is the official term for them. He said, we are Dalit, the broken people. But in that designation, there is also a deep aspiration and hope. So this is your breakdown. What I want to draw your attention to is caste is a pan-religious phenomenon in South Asia. So it is a primarily Hindu phenomenon, but it is not restricted to Hindus. You have caste in Muslims, you have caste in Christianity. I did my fieldwork for the book that David generously referenced in the southern peninsula state of Kerala. And I was staying with a family whose son went to university with me, and so I was doing a lot of fieldwork through the grandmother who seemed to know everybody. And I was once late coming for mass, and so I just entered the church, and she was so mad at me because she said, you entered the church through the Dalit entrance. And I had no idea that this church had two doors, and one was for upper caste Christians and one was for lower caste Christians. And in my hurry and ignorance, I had gone through the lower caste entrance to the church. And that was my own entry point into the existence of caste across all religions. So caste has many parallels to race in America, and of course this was very powerfully brought out by Isabel Wilkerson. Martin Luther King famously visited India in 1959. He said, to all other countries I may go as a tourist, but to India I come as a pilgrim. And in that same peninsular state of Kerala that I referred to, he was addressing a group of school children when the principal of the school introduced him and said, this is Dr. King. We are so fortunate to have him here today. He comes from the untouchable castes of America. And Isabel Wilkinson describes in her book that initially Dr. King was quite peeved, even a little offended at this description. And then she says, you know, he reflected upon it and said, look at the position of African Americans in America today. And he says, yes, I am an untouchable. And so he came to embrace this and say, yes, we are untouchables. We are the Dalits of the US. And there have been many parallels drawn also in the way that Dalits have mobilized in terms of drawing on the history of African-American Black resistance, the civil rights movement in the US. So both are hierarchies. Caste does have that additional dimension in that it has a ritual element to it. They're occupational hierarchies. There's, much like race in America, there's a big overlap between caste and class, and also critically marriage. So of course there are the infamous anti-miscegnation laws in the US, but I want to point out to you that this is data from India today. And you will see that a majority of Hindus, and look at the wording of the question, it's not just about whether it's inappropriate. The wording of the survey question is, do you think it is crucial to stop intercaste marriage? And you can still see the degree of agreement with this question. And so caste is a kind of founding, Louis Dumont, who wrote about caste, says endogamy is one of the founding principles of caste. And if you visit India, if you don't know too much about caste, where it will be most visible to you will be in the domain of marriage. So again, Emily Schmoll nicely referred to the fact that, newspapers are well and thriving in India today. I loved that image that she showed of two people reading the same newspaper. I was describing to my partner this morning how we were never allowed to read the whole newspaper. As soon as the newspaper came, it was divided up. The neighbors took one part, and then someone else took another part. But a newspaper in India is communal property. But the most important part of the newspaper, which of course I was oblivious to growing up, was because my parents had married out of love, different castes, with this section. It's the matrimonial section. And again, you will see this entire section is divided by caste. And what I'm struck by when I visit India regularly, at least a couple, if not more times a year, is now you have entire supplements for certain castes. And so this is not something that's disappearing. If anything, in my observation, it is increasing. Much like race, caste is a site of both everyday discrimination and also of intense violence. And of course, as Indians have come to America, so too has caste. Some of you might have looked at the Washington Post and the New York Times reportage about the caste bias problem, which of course led to the bill to try to make anti-caste discrimination a form of legal discrimination within the US. And it's not just a site of this discrimination and violence, but also of political mobilization. And I promised you that there were these resonances between Dalit mobilization and Black mobilization. And here you can see it, I think, most clearly in that this is the Dalit Panthers of India. No surprises for guessing who it is that they are drawing on in symbols, in rhetoric, in aspiration. This is Mayawati, India's first Dalit chief minister, who, again, talking about the politics of memory, has made sure that she is quite literally present in terms of the monumental landscape. She was famous for putting in place these life-sized statues of herself. And also in terms of to kind of end the parallels with race in America for caste, the attempts to institutionally redress them have been parallel. So affirmative action in India has actually been relatively uncontroversial for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. It's been in place since India became independent in 1947. And most political scientists, sociologists would say that it has had a mixed impact in terms of socioeconomic development, but where it's had the most important impact has been in the politics of dignity. And you see this again and again, important books that have come out that have shown how important this affirmative action has been in terms of giving Dalits a sense of voice and a sense of dignity. And I'll just give you a little glimpse of why it is that the politics of dignity is so deeply important. And that is because, and this is just a glimpse into it, manual scavenging is the worst surviving symbol of untouchability. And I just again want to point out that I have not picked out pictures of women. Most manual scavenging in India is done by Dalit women. And so this is just one of many quotes I could tell you in which this young woman says, I clean toilets in 20 houses every day. I use a tin plate and a broom to remove the excrement that is collected in the toilet. I collect it in a basket and then I take it and throw it away. This work is so awful, I don't feel like eating. And there are Amnesty International Human Rights Watch reports on just how demeaning, of how dehumanizing such tasks are. They're still mostly done by Dalits, and this is where you have to understand the impact of affirmative action and the politics of dignity that it has allowed. I also want to point out about the continuation of what are often called caste-based beliefs or caste-based anxieties, often called racial anxieties as well, interestingly, in the US. And so these are women who've tried to leave manual scavenging. And you see first in which the woman on top, I'm sorry that the text is quite small, says that she would leave it, but she fears that she will be evicted from her home if she stops. And these are 4 women who actually had to get police protection because they tried to give up doing manual scavenging. And to me, this is indicative of the presence of something called caste-based beliefs. And now I'm going to get you into the territory that you were in with David and Professor Subramanian at the end of the last session, which are questions of kind of social welfare more broadly. So Myron Weiner, a political scientist in MIT, many years ago wrote a thin, powerful, provocative firecracker of a book called The Child and State in India. And in that, Myron Weiner, a longtime India scholar, said, look, India gets independent in 1947, literacy rate is 12%. Vast majority of India is illiterate, and yet it does not prioritize primary education. When education is prioritized, it's higher education. And on the other hand, it does not make child labor illegal. And he says the two are connected. The lack of emphasis on primary education and the legalization, essentially, of child labor are a piece of the fact that upper castes think that lower castes should be working with their hands and not with their minds. This, as you can imagine, was a deeply controversial argument in India. It remains so now. But I think these prevalence of caste-based beliefs, the racial anxieties that drive opposition to primary education, and the tolerance for child labor remain important today. And that's why I showed you the backlash against some of these women who've tried to leave this dehumanizing occupation of manual scavenging. So I've already gone through this. Sometimes it's just important to kind of, I know you've already had your China year at Camden, but it's important to kind of just, and we heard references in Professor Tellis and in Ambassador Rao's to China, but it's just important to sometimes think about it. And India, independent in 1947, China in 1949, and I'm writing a book that compares the two countries right now at a different historical period. But you look at the investment in primary education in China that leads to an almost twice as much increase, such that by 1981, China is almost 70% literate. And that's where that gap, talking about when it is that Professor Teller said, when is it that you kind of break away in a way? China has done that in a way that India hasn't. I mean, this is not to deny that there have been massive improvements. Professor Subramanian referred to them in education and health, but 50% of rural women remain illiterate. There are large numbers of out-of-school children. 30 to 40% of total children in India are classified today as being undernourished. The official definition is stunted or wasting. And 50% of women and children in the latest National Family and Health Survey in India are considered anemic. So important progress, but a long, long way to go, especially at the national level. But what I want to point out is that within this national picture of, a tradition, a legacy, a post-colonial legacy of underdevelopment, but then important gains in the last few decades, there are different worlds of welfare within India. And this is the book that David mentioned in my generous introduction talked about. So this is India classified by infant mortality and literacy rates. And just to give you a sense, India is a federation like the US, but demographically it's something else, right? So the southern, I'm sure I can find a laser pointer here, the southern peninsular state of Kerala, where Professor Rao is from, is demographically equal to Canada. Uttar Pradesh, right there, is demographically larger than Russia. If you happen to be a woman born in the state of Kerala in the 1990s in the countryside, you will on average live 15 years more on average than if you're born in the state of UP. In Bihar, which is give and take the size of France, you will be 4 times more likely to be illiterate than if you're born in the northern state of Himachal Pradesh. So within one country with very similar electoral, legal, financial institutions, you've had these different worlds of welfare. And here's where I want to kind of come down to my last form of diversity in India, which is language. And so in the book, I actually say these differences that I just showed you come down to differences in the strength of linguistic solidarity, in a certain sense of we-ness that comes from a common language. So even though India is diverse along multiple different kinds of different ethnic identities, it is most diverse on language. And so this is something called an ethno-linguistic diversity index, which shows you the likelihood that someone that you meet will be from a different ethnic group. And so in India, there's an 80 to 90% likelihood that someone that you meet will have a different mother tongue than you will. This shows it another way, but it's interesting because I wasn't quite expecting the US to be number 5, but these are your most linguistically diverse countries in the world, and India's up there in number 4. I always love Papua New Guinea, which is not a country you think very much about, and then it's always, it's up there in terms of number 1. India has 22 languages in the constitution, 2 official languages, both English and Hindi. I can talk at length about this, but no national language. And there's a difference between national language and official language, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But within this kind of landscape of linguistic diversity, the critical difference between India and the US is that India is a linguistic federation. And what that means is that these are the boundaries that India inherits when it becomes independent in 1947. And very soon after independence, there begin these movements for the redrawing of these colonially inherited boundaries around linguistic lines. Now, I've already told you that one partition of India was the founding trauma. So you can imagine that these demands for linguistic states did not go down well. There were deep fears, including from a number of Indians, of a number of Americans in India, that this was going to lead to a second division of India. But eventually Nehru, in a way a true democrat, agreed to these demands, and India was restructured along linguistic lines. And so this is your contemporary map of India, and each state of India in some ways maps onto a distinct, unique language. And the main argument that I make in the book is that states in India, mostly in southern, western India, that have had a very strong sense of linguistic solidarity, a strong sense of we-ness, are also the same states that have put in place much better social welfare policies that have had impacts for human development. And I just want to, just because I really have to, I just want to say that, so Professor Subramaniam really emphasized economic growth as a motor for human development. I just want to point out that the gains for states like Kerala, their Tamil Nadu next to it, happened when they were in very precarious economic situations. And so the human development of these states happened independent of and prior to economic development. And so I actually contest historically that argument that economic development is necessarily the motor for social development. And I'll just end by saying that, not only has linguistic diversity not been destructive for India, it has been constructive for social welfare, but I also just want to point out that this is December 2023. India, as you already heard, will be having national elections in a few months, but these are state-level elections. And to me, it's not any coincidence that states in India that have a distinct, unique language, linguistic solidarity are the same states where the BJP has had a harder time. And these are the same states that are not only generative for social welfare, they're also a bulwark, a safeguard against the kind of encroaching, centralizing authoritarian tendencies from the center. I promised you that I'll take you right back to the end. And so I want to end with Professor Rao's reference to India as a mosaic. And to David pushing back on her on this mosaic. And hopefully what I've tried to give you is a little bit of a sense of some of these pieces of the mosaic, and to say that as you pay attention to the mosaic, and it's a dynamic time for India, as you know, as you pay attention to the mosaic that India is making, please also keep in mind the mosaic that it is breaking. Thank you.